This is All Talk with Tom Jordan and Kevin Dietz on 760 WJR.
These arguments are decades old. The whole collective bargaining and, labor unions protect workers. And if you don't support unions, you're taking away rights. We've even heard claims that unions are a natural-born human right. Really? What about the union's dominance over politicians and industries? And yes, the union dominance over workers themselves. I mean, some believe forced union membership actually strips away the rights of workers. And Kevin, that's why I think right-to-work legislation, it matters to a lot of people, and it's gaining support at the federal level.
What about the corruption in unions?
Right.
Congressman Joe Wilson, Republican South Carolina, introduced the National Right to Work Act in the U.S. House of Representatives. The bill is part of a two-pronged strategy, which consists of building support in Washington for the National Right to Work Act, while at the same time mobilizing opponents of forced unionism to pass their own state rights to work laws. Right-to-work states have seen increased job growth compared to forced union states, and workers in right-to-work states earn more in real income when cost of living is taken into account, he says. Joining us now is Mark Mix, president of the National Rights to Work Committee. Good morning. How are you?
Well, I'm great, Kevin. Thank you for having me on. Thank you, Tom, as well. And this is a kind of a current debate here in Washington, and also, actually, imagine this, in Lansing, Michigan.
It absolutely is. It's important. Can you frame the debate for us?
Absolutely. Well, let me talk about Joe Wilson's bill, because that's really kind of the premise and the foundational stone of the right to work issue. Back in 1935, the United States Congress, with Roosevelt's encouragement of the Supreme Court, ruled that federal law would cover private sector labor management relations in the country. They took it away from the states, they brought it to Washington, and they've screwed it up ever since. But anyway, so the federal law, the federal default is forced unionism. And so basically, in states that don't have right to work laws, there's no statute that says you have to pay union dues. That's federal authority that gives union officials the right to have a worker fired if they don't join or pay dues or fees to the union. So in 1947, the Congress came back and said, we've done something, we need to fix a little bit. They allowed states to pass what are known as right-to-work laws, and they are really simple, Tom and Kevin. They basically say, your right to join a union is protected under federal law, and frankly, the right-to-work laws have been used to protect workers' ability to join unions in the past as well. And so it doesn't stop anyone from associating with the union, paying the union, joining the union, giving their entire paycheck to the union, but it doesn't contemplate the idea that you lose your job simply because you don't support this private organization that you didn't vote for, didn't want, and didn't ask for, but was imposed on you by federal law and by federal rules that say that you can be forced into an association with a union even though you don't want to be in that association. And so the right to work laws protect that individual freedom. And that's what this bill does in Washington. It's literally a one-page bill. And Tom and Kevin, I know you probably talked about, 4,000 or 3,900-page bills and 2,700-page bills over the last year or so, or maybe 2 years, but you've talked about those. This is a one-page bill that doesn't add a single word to federal law. It simply goes into that 1935 law, and it says the bias will be in favor of voluntary unionism. So if you want to join a union, have at it. If you want to be part of a union, have at it. In fact, in Michigan, even if you don't have a union in your company, you can join a union and pay dues to a union if you want. I don't know why people would do that if they don't have the union, but you can, and nothing stops it. So the bill in Congress that Joe Wilson introduced, literally one page, doesn't add a single word. The bill in Michigan we're fighting against is the bill that would repeal the right-to-work law that was passed almost 10 years ago, back in 2013.
What will happen to Wilson's bill? Will it make it to the Senate? Will it get signed?
Well, I don't think so. The important part of that bill is to have the debate about compulsory unionism. Union officials promoted this Gallup poll. They came out of, I don't know, maybe it was August of last year or July of last year, that talked about the highest percentage of union favorability in the country since the 1960s, saying something like 65% of or 70% of people said that they had a generally favorable view of unions. But that was the headline question. If you went in and looked at question number 2, it said, how interested are you in joining a union? 80% of the people that answered the original question, they had a favorable opinion, said, hey, yeah, you know what, I'm not interested. Only 20% said they had, real interest or some interest. The rest of them said, I don't want it, I have little interest, and I have no interest in joining a union. So the idea of voluntary unionism is something that we must have. You know, people always say unions had a place back in the, turn of the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. I say this, unions had a place then, they have a place now, and they have a place in the future, but there's no place for compulsion in that equation, in that chronological, basically, advancement of unionism. There's no place for force in and compulsion in unionism, and that's what we're defending in Michigan, and that's what Joe Wilson's trying to do here in Washington,
Right,
D.C.
it's the mandate aspect of it. It's the same thing you can argue with the vaccines. People might support vaccines, but the mandate to take them is different than having the freedom to choose, and that's the same thing with unions. I used to support unions, and it sounds great on the surface until I saw far too many examples in my own life of abuse within unions. And right now, they're pushing legislators to support now the PRO Act, which essentially goes back to prohibiting these right-to-work laws across the country once again. They claim it's going to enshrine protections for workers. Obviously, you would disagree with that.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. There is no protection for workers in the PRO Act. There's lots of protections for union officials, and it's important that we segregate those two, because when you think about the disconnect between rank-and-file union members and union officials, and there's been no better story over the last 5 or 6 years than the United Auto Workers Union. My goodness.
Right.
You've got 14 UAW officials that I think went to jail, or maybe some of them are still in jail. I know a couple of them are out on good behavior. But you had the 2 past international presidents of the UAW go to jail because they were able to collect all this money from everybody as a condition of their employment, and then they used the union dues and the legal fees to help them get through the problems they had with the federal prosecutor out there. And I think one of the best arguments for right to work is the accountability and the ability it gives workers to hold union officials accountable when they find out that this stuff is happening. If you're a UAW member in a non-right to work state, you were compelled to pay dues and fees that went up the ladder to the international UAW, and you could do nothing about it. If you tried to stop it, you'd lose your job. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, in Michigan, we are a right-to-work state now, but that's being threatened with this new Democratic legislature. They want to scrap it and go back to giving unions full control again. Here's my question, because I thought that the U.S. Supreme Court already ruled on this whole matter, that this union dues requirement is unconstitutional. Is that not the case?
Well, it is partially, Tom, and good for you. That was a case that was argued in the U.S. Supreme Court by National Right to Work Foundation attorneys. The attorney I'm looking out my door, and his office is right across the hall here.
Wow.
He argued the case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Janus v. AFSCME. And what that case was all about was whether or not government employees had First Amendment protections from forced unionism. And we'd been litigating that issue going back to 1977 in a case that came out of Michigan, interestingly enough, called Abood, which was on behalf of some teachers, and whether or not they could be forced to pay dues to a union in order to keep their job. And finally, in 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court looked at it, and a majority said, you know what? Everything that government unions do is political. They're speaking to redress government. They're trying to get government to do certain things, and that's redressing government. That's political speech. And so if it's political speech, then it's protected by the First Amendment. And so the majority of the court said these workers' First Amendment rights will not allow the unions to take money from their paychecks. So right now, we have national right to work protections for every government employee in America. What they want to do in Michigan, they can't overturn that in Michigan. That's the one thing. They wish they could, I'm sure, but they can't do that. So we're talking about private sector employees right now. We think that private sector employees should have the same First Amendment rights that public sector employees do, but that's a bridge a little farther away down the road.
Agree with you 100%. Mark Mix, I so appreciate your time. We do. President of the National Right to Work Committee. Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Kevin.
Have a great day.